Thanks, Lawrence. It's been a long day already, and I see more and more smartphones coming out. So we're going to try to revert that trend here. We do want to make it really inclusive at the end. So I'm going to try to see if we can do 20-25 minutes of Q&A and some discussion as well, not just ask questions and get answers. But so we're going to try to keep our answers really short here. I have many questions, but let's have really a dialogue about innovation. And by the way, it's great to be here with so many executives from so many different utilities and energy companies from all over the world. A lot has been said about innovation, and also today, and I think the topic for this panel, we really want to approach innovation from a broader perspective than just technology, because when people say innovation, they think technology. From our perspective, and we'll talk more about that as well, it's more than technology. It's about products and services that you provide to your customers, so customer value. It's about revenue streams and business models that actually create value for your shareholders. That's innovation as well, and I think there's a lot of innovation needed around these business models that actually make these technologies work as part of products and services that you provide to your customers. And then there's also a lot of innovation around governance and what processes are companies following to innovate, and what platforms do utilities and energy companies use to innovate. So today hopefully will be a broader discussion than just technology innovation. There's a lot of technologies out there, but it's really how do we make it work, and that requires a lot more than just the technology by itself. We will also try to give, and I will challenge my panelists here, not putting them on the spot, but try to give some specific examples of how they innovated with regard to the process, with regard to the product services, with regard to the technology itself, whatever. Going to start with a general question for each of the panelists, and I think Heather is going to kick it off with a video and a small presentation. But the question is, how does your organization look at innovation? What strategies have you followed in terms of innovating with your teams? And if you can, give us specific examples of how you innovated within your organization. And Heather, I think you want to lead it in first.
Yeah, actually, well, I think maybe this time of day, we maybe all could use a little video.
Absolutely.
So it's a bit of a shameless promotional video that organizations such as OPG produce. So I'm going to hit it off with that, and then I'll take you just through a handful of slides, give you something to look at, kind of give you the context for where things are at with Ontario, more specifically around transportation electrification. I'll end it off actually with sort of where we're looking to innovate in that space, and that might then lead the broader group through. So if you can move to the next slide for the shameless video, but might wake everybody up. Okay, so if the clicker, is it working? Oh, it is. Okay, so as I said, I mean, a big feature of that video is about the clean renewable power we have in Ontario. And this graph is just to give you a snapshot of how far we've come on that front. So this is sort of greenhouse gas emissions, and just shows how drastically they've fallen over the course of the last decade or so. The green line being the broader Ontario electricity system, and the red line OPG. So we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions at OPG by 99%. So the power we produce is now 99% greenhouse gas free. And the broader Ontario electricity system is about 90% greenhouse gas free. So very clean. And you can see there as the bars go down, not unlike the stacks of the coal yards, it's been largely due to coal closure. And I mean, I would have to say in Ontario we take great pride in the closure of coal has been the single largest single act, I guess, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in North America. So something very significant, something that's been very costly, but now it's incumbent upon us, I think, to really benefit from that. Okie doke. So electricity is actually the lowest emitting major sector in Ontario. So there it is at the very bottom of that graph, a mere 3% of the wedge in Ontario. And then as you start to stack up the other pieces, you can see quite clearly heavy industry and buildings are a big piece of it. But then the final is transportation. And that comprises 35% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the province. So when you're thinking about, what do you do now to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario, and probably in many other jurisdictions that have similar clean fleets, is you don't focus on that final piece of the wedge, because it's going to be extremely costly to get rid of that final piece of the wedge. You're far better off taking all the billions that you've invested in the clean assets and now just parlaying that into your transportation sector. And just interestingly enough, on the right-hand side there are the emissions goals that we have and the targets associated with the Climate Change Action Plan, our provincial goals, and you can see they are extremely aggressive. And they're relative to 1990 emissions, but rather than spend time thinking about how we're never going to get there, I think we'd best just turn our attention to trying to get there. So as you think about, this button's not working. Okay. As you think about, I'm just going to click right through. There we go. As you think about electrification of transportation, and you look at it, it's an absolute win-win situation, at least in jurisdictions with clean generation portfolios. So over the fullness of time, I think the numbers out to about 2037, so a 20-year projection from last year. You have the ability in an aggressive EV penetration scenario, which puts about 3 million electric vehicles on the roads. We only have 15,000 now, so it's in a very aggressive scenario. You have the ability, though, to reduce your GHG emissions on an annual basis by 9 megatons, which is significant. The additional piece that comes along with that really makes it the win-win, though, is because you are then spreading the fixed cost of your assets that you've built up over a larger demand, you're actually reducing your electricity prices on a per unit basis. So it really is one of those things that's a win-win, no-brainer. And then of course, over the time, you're increasing your electricity demand, which, as we all look out at the projections, we see pretty flat growth in the province. And electrification is a huge source of increasing your electricity demand. But I'll just click this through. With all things, there's a bit of a catch to all of this. And really, it's around how you go about electrifying transportation. And if you do not manage your EV load growth or your electric vehicle charging in a very smart way, you can actually worsen the situation. So here's sort of an illustrative scenario where you have a 24-hour demand curve, and you can see that the whole way that this whole idea hangs together, both in terms of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions and getting your cost savings, is if you charge overnight. If you come home and charge, as others have said today, if you do convenience charging or you come home right after work and you plug in, you're going to be adding to the peak. And we've actually done some pretty frightening analysis that shows that if there's a high EV growth scenario, so the one that I spoke of out to 2037, where you actually have about 3 million electric vehicles on the road, and you pay no mind to when charging happens, and you in fact create another peak, you can need 15 gas plants in Ontario to provide that power. And that takes you the absolute wrong direction. So it really illustrates the importance of managing the charging.
But you could also come home and not charge it, but discharge it.
Yes.
That would reduce the peak.
Yes, well, I'll get to that notion. Yeah, so the idea here is, and what do I mean by managed charging? So there's different ways you can do that, but smart charging. Charging apparatus where you determine when you're going to charge your vehicle, and it goes on at 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning or whenever it is, and it says how much you're going to charge. Smart charging, or also having proper incentives that really drive the right behaviors, the right charging behaviors. So whether it's free overnight charging, time of use, something like that, it is really critical. And then as you said, and this is kind of, okay, sorry, that's the last bit. So great energy cloud from Navigant that we stole. So in terms of, okay, what is all that? So doing electrification in Ontario is clearly the right thing to do, is the next big step we can all take in terms of climate change. It's also the next step towards innovation, and it's something that we're really focusing on at OPG. And I guess I would drive your attention to the vehicle in the more or less the left center of that picture. And there will be, arising from electrification of transportation, significant opportunities to do with vehicle grid integration. And this is a really key area where we're looking at. And what that really means is you got to think about the world that I've spoken about, where there's maybe 3 million vehicles on the road, or maybe there's even upwards of that. and how do you access, OPG would like to have access to those car batteries and be able to aggregate that residual capacity or power that remains in those vehicles, aggregate it and feed it back into the grid during times of peak demand. Sounds sort of simple when I say it that way, but it's actually an extremely complicated sort of undertaking, both from a technical and a commercial perspective. And that's one of the biggest areas that we're looking at from an innovation perspective at OPG.
Thanks, Heather. And since you referenced our energy cloud picture here, and back to Chris this morning, I see so many utilities and energy companies trying to create a new apple from an old apple. So this is not an apple-to-apple comparison. In this energy cloud, there's a big watermelon. And there's opportunities to get into office buildings, into manufacturing plants, into homes. There's opportunities to support transportation with electric power. There's opportunities with regard to distributed energy resources. And there's opportunities to take electrification into smart cities. So there is a bigger customer and shareholder value. And if you look at it that way, then existing regulation doesn't matter because it's different in this new world. Existing revenue streams don't matter, or rate designs don't matter, because there's new revenue streams and different ways of charging customers for those products and services that you provide. So this notion of completely stepping out of the box into the energy cloud and say this is a different world that we're in now, and what can that do in terms of opportunity? We believe strongly there's a much bigger opportunity, a much larger opportunity for utilities and energy companies going forward than just providing safe, reliable, affordable, commodity electricity to the customers. And that is really, I think, the discussion that we want to have when we talk about innovation. So Jay, you're waking up. It's early in the morning now for you, right? So talking about time differences here. For a transmission company in New Zealand, how do you guys look at innovation? What have you done? Give us a specific, really cool example.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And good morning, everybody. It is just coming up to 6 o'clock.
Yes.
I'm sure several of you are in completely different time zones. You're very lucky you haven't got me on in the morning. You've had your video. Let's do a bit of stretching. How many of you have been to New Zealand? Yep, good show of population. So if I take you to a remote location, relatively remote, 2 islands, where there's 23 million sheep and only 4 million people. Innovation is actually part of our mix. And let me explain that. If you get onto your Google and you type in number 8 wire NZ, it'll tell you 2 things. First of all, it'll cover the gauge of wire that was used, obviously, in the wiring to keep the sheep in the right place. But the second thing it will tell you is that number 8 wire is actually an attitude in New Zealand, referring to being able to make stuff out of what you've got lying around. A real Kiwi-type attitude in terms of a can-do attitude to fix and change stuff. And so to start with the people that we've got in the country where I work, we've got that mindset already in terms of always looking at different ways of doing things. That's a really, really good start. And if you don't have that in your mix, in your teams, think about it really, really carefully. So let me twist it around then and say Transpower. We're a transmission company, state-owned, highly regulated. If I turn around to the regulator and go, give us some money for innovation. Yeah? Out of the $1.4 billion that they've given me, $1.4 billion they've given me over the last 5 years, guess how many million was towards innovation? Who wants to guess? Yep. 0? No, slightly more than 0. All of it? No, far out.
You wish.
Out. $8 million. Yeah? I'll let you do your own percentage of the 1.4 billion, and if you think about it in terms of how much you like to have for a pay rise, it doesn't even come close. And so we've got a regulator who's stuck in this stance, and another twist to that, we've had a distribution business putting a customized price path to the regulator recently, and they putting a percentage for innovation as part of their forward-thinking works, and they got hardly any of it from the regulator. Why? You all sat there going, why? Everyone's talking about innovation being a big thing. Everyone talks about it being an absolute requirement within a business and the community where we work. yet the regulator doesn't seem to be supporting it. Their response was this: you couldn't show me exactly what you were going to spend it on and the exact benefit I was going to get. So let me answer the last bit in terms of what Transpower's up to. So you turn around and go, running any business, you have continuous business improvement. Yeah, you always want to do better. You always want to try and suppress your operating costs, increase your profits. And so you then turn around and go, well, there's R&D, research and development. Right? And so where does innovation fit in? Yeah? What makes innovation different than R&D? What makes innovation different than continued business development? And at Transpower, we see innovation as being different to those two. Yeah? We're always continuously looking at how to drive and how to get changes. And if I give an example of that, robots. How many of you use robots within your businesses? Come on, this is interactive session today. A few of you. Yeah, we've got a remote substation site where we regularly get outages. And to send someone to that site, you either need to base someone at that site, and they spend most of their time fishing in the lake, by the way, or it's a 3-hour drive. Now, we've developed a robot, not for us, but in conjunction with other parties who have those expertise and that know-how in terms of basically helping us develop these things. And we can remote operate this thing, drive around anywhere in our substation, peer at what might have gone wrong. It can actually look at a dollar coin nailed on the wall and read the fine print of the wording in the camera. Yeah, pretty amazing technology. So if I use that as an example, it's something where it's thought outside of the box, it's engaged with external people who have those expertise to bring that innovation and that connection back through to us. So I'll pause it there.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're coming a couple of time zones west again. Jonathan, CEO of GRIDCo transmission business in Ghana. And maybe it's good to explain a little bit what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in terms of your business, and then how do you innovate within your company?
Thank you, Jan. GRIDCo primarily is the transmission company of Ghana. It is a state monopoly, which was carved from the Volta River Authority, which used to be the generator and then the transmission company. But with the infusion of IPPs, it was thought wise to separate GRIDCo from Volta River Authority. So for our business, we transmit the energy that is produced by the IPP and the state-owned generators to the distribution companies and other bulk suppliers. For us, innovation, as you rightly said, is not only about technology. It's not only about technology, but then as a transmission company,
technology.
Yeah, technology. As a transmission company, our core business is to provide the energy people need and in a sustainable way. To deliver our core purpose in these challenging times, we recognize innovation as a necessity. We are currently undergoing a business process transformation for our company, and at the core of our values is responsiveness. And being responsive in this fast-moving industry requires a great use of technology. Innovation in the network automation and optimization segment is primarily driving changing patterns of both electricity generation and electricity demand, along with associated aging grid infrastructure. We need to renew our infrastructure. Thus, for a company which is set out to improve upon its financial solvency, the use of technology is one of the cardinal pillars of achieving our goal. Currently, in our organization and in one of our departments, we have set up an innovation unit, and we have also strengthened our collaboration with our customers who are solely in charge of innovation. With the engineering universities in Ghana, because for us to keep abreast with technologies, we have to improve upon our service delivery. We have also done major upgrades of our substations. We have replaced OCBs, which were installed about 35 years ago with fast SF6 breakers. And then we have changed our electromechanical relays to smarter digital relays. So these are parts of some of the innovations that we are undertaking as a company.
Okay. Yeah, a great example in terms of collaborating with others as well. I have a team of 600 people in this space globally. I have 50 people that do full-time research, full-time, Monday through Friday, 50 people following all the new technologies and business models. And I can tell you all, they cannot keep up. So I have a team of 50 people trying to keep up. They cannot. That's how much is going on. So you will need to find partners and platforms that you will help innovate. You can't do it. You can't do it on your own. John, question from an investor perspective. So we've heard that some say, well, the regulators are not allowing us to innovate. Some might think that utilities are not innovative enough by themselves. What is the value of innovation for investors? What's the value of innovation for shareholders? What's the deal there?
Yeah, I think that's one of the great questions that we all are sort of focused on, I think, as an industry and trying to sort of resolve as we speak. It's a very exciting time, as we sort of talked about, just in terms of the presence of new technology and the rate of change. But the real question is, as we sort of think about the value of a utility or the value of a given sort of technology or technological approach, the real question is, as you sort of try to look into the future, how will that technology be incorporated into a utility franchise or into the grid, et cetera, is very much the open question. And part of the reason it is the open question, in my mind, is that there is sort of a chasm between, in many cases, sort of how and where technology develops and how and where that technology is implemented, again, by a utility or in the grid. I think, Stephen, sort of the example that you provided earlier is very relevant here in a U.S. Or North American context, which is that regulators and customers and advocacy groups are, I think, first and foremost, they want technology, but first and foremost, they're very, very focused on cost and efficiency. That really is the overriding factor. And I think there's a real opportunity in that, by the way, for the industry, because when I think about the world that I grew up in as a child, I remember, my dad paying, 25 cents for a cup of coffee, right? Today, we spend $5 at Starbucks. That's a world that I don't think...
Very sophisticated coffee, though.
Well, right, exactly. And that's a world that I don't think that his generation would have ever envisioned. On a relative basis, however, the cost of electricity and the value proposition that this industry, certainly in North America and globally, provide is much less expensive. However, as an industry, we sort of face more and more pushback from regulators to keep rates as low as possible. But what lost, I think, in that sort of equation is the opportunity to communicate to customers and to communicate to, obviously, regulators by proxy, the value proposition associated with having this industry really own not only the cost, but also the reward associated with technological advancement. And I think of that in sort of two buckets, right? One is I think, customer interaction. So think about things like many of the topics that have been talked about, but for example, demand response or different types of products, et cetera, that enhance the customer experience. And then I think there's sort of I'll call it the physical technology, products and other elements that are incorporated into the grid generation profile, as you sort of talked about earlier. Anyway, so there's sort of a disconnect there. I think not only do regulators not necessarily always really proactively reward the industry, it's also markets, by the way. If you're going to, for example, I think about where solar and wind were 15 or 20 years ago, right? Without subsidies, it'd be very difficult to incorporate that technology, if you will, into the grid without it being sort of economic, sort of right off the bat. So there's an opportunity, I think, for the industry to effectively expand that provision that you talked about for R&D within the context of really the utilities, the IPPs, et cetera, the principal owners of not only assets but really the ultimate customer experience. And I think that to the degree that we're able to solve that equation, that has the potential to accelerate the integration and acceptance of new approaches, new technologies. But we also live in a world, I think, there's a panel that will take place later this afternoon, where the financing markets don't necessarily always, particularly for utilities here in North America, don't always sort of right off the bat reward that kind of innovation because we live in an EPS-driven world, right? And so there's a cost associated with R&D that again, in a world where we're focused primarily on efficiency in the near term, and EPS is difficult to integrate. However, I think in many respects the Holy Grail may be, again, expanding that provision from the regulators that allows effectively an efficient sort of sharing, if you will, of the risk and reward associated with technology, not only by shareholders, but also by customers, so that hopefully everyone kind of wins in an equation where the industry is able to, again, really drive those innovations more proactively.
But specifically, you support a lot of M&A transactions. Do investors today or going forward, will they look differently at the value of an energy company utility that is more advanced, that is more innovative, that is, you know, maybe less carbon, more renewables, a smarter grid with smart meters? Does that matter to investors, financial investors?
I think we're still at a sort of transitory state where sort of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And what I mean by that is we're talking about issues that are 5, 10, 20 years into the future, right? Electric vehicles, right? What's any given investor's view as to sort of what the penetration is going to be, how infrastructure is going to be integrated within a utility context, et cetera. I think there's still a wide range of views around that. And so while on the margin, I believe that there really is value associated with companies being sort of more forward-looking in that regard. So I'll segregate your question into two areas. One is the public markets. I don't believe that the public markets are really capable of looking 5, 10 years into the future. I really, and I think that's one of the real challenges. Looking around the room here, and you know, some of you all obviously run public companies, and so you know it's all about quarter over quarter. And while it's helpful and interesting to be able to be seen as sort of progressive and forward-looking, I'm not sure that that the public markets, I think they'll give you some benefit, but it's very, very difficult, challenging to sort of quantify too far into the future. So the more private investors, strategic markets, I think are more capable of trying to quantify some of those elements. But again, it's still there's still a very wide range of views. The area where it's maybe a little bit more straightforward is around carbon intensity and sort of innovation around that. That is very, very clear, I think, focus on that. And yeah, I think that that's where you see more evidence, whether it's with IPPs or utilities, around there being a much stronger sort of perceived value associated with being politically de-risked, if you will, by being sort of more progressive on carbon.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at earnings, I think a lot of CEOs now do talk about grid modernization, about investments that they're making in a smarter grid. The reason for that is because, you know, they want to rate base it and get paid for it. Right. But they also want to clearly show a steady, you know, growing, revenue stream for the utility. So I do not completely agree with you. I think CEOs are actually using, you know, innovation and modernization of their assets as a platform to create more shareholder value.
Yeah, let me
switch to Heather and Jay here. So we spoke about the regulators. What about your shareholders? How do you think your shareholders look at innovation? How important innovation is? How much they're willing to play ball around investments in innovation, Heather?
Well, actually, just to build,
Sure,
our shareholder is the province, so it's a bit of a unique situation. Well, not that unique, I guess, but a bit of a different situation than the public markets. One thing I would say is I do think in Ontario we're seeing the tide shift a bit on this innovation piece. So our energy board that oversees the vast majority of utilities in the province, and we are the only generator actually that is rate regulated in the province, but they are undergoing a modernization process, as you spoke about, and one of the key tenets of that is innovation, and how should they be viewing innovation, whether you're speaking about distributed energy resources, what does that mean for the LDC, the local distribution companies, what does that mean for Hydro One, the main transmitter, what does it mean for all of us, and how should it be treated? So hopefully we won't end up in the situation where you're asked, okay, well, I'll approve $8 million over X billion, and we couldn't give you more because you can't show what you're going to do with it. Because I think one of the fundamental tenets of innovation is that if you do it right, you're probably going to fail sometimes. And you're not going to know exactly what you're going to do. You don't know exactly when you're going to make that return. You don't really know what that's going to look like. And that's a very hard thing to bring forward in a company that's driven by what's your ROE or what's it going to be. And I've already personally observed that on this electrification portfolio. Something I thought was a brilliant idea a year ago, I now see as being the worst idea ever. You know, there was no way it was ever going to be commercially viable. So I think within the innovation space, you have to allow for that. And in terms of the shareholder, I mean, the province expects us to, you know, advance things within the province for the, you know, the betterment of the ratepayers, the same way they have that probably same expectation of others.
Yes, your shareholder is your customer at the same time, at least the citizens in the province.
That's a good, yes, exactly.
Stephen, I said Jason, that's difficulty with two first names. Stephen, what about your shareholders?
Our shareholder is the government.
Right.
And so any dividend that we produce goes straight back to the government in terms of the Treasury. Now, you look at what their drivers are. If we've got a regulated asset base, so if we build more assets, we can charge more in terms of the return on those assets, and the component of the transmission price of electricity goes up. Do you think there's a political feel that we ought to put the price of electricity up? No. No. They want it to be relatively flat, if going up should be less than inflation. So you then turn around to the Treasury and say, okay, well, if I haven't got an increasing revenue line, how can I have an increasing profit line? Well, no, different story, different department. Yeah? They don't have cups of tea together. And so we're stuck, yeah? We're stuck with a Treasury going, well, we want to see a return on our asset base, but you don't want to increase it over here to drive your revenue. So you're then left with the component of trying to drive cost out of the business, which you could do for a certain degree until you don't have a business that operates and functions correctly. Yep. I think, and I'd be really controversial here, and I apologise for any regulator out there, but what I've seen from regulations, and I've worked in various places around the world, is that they tend to follow trends rather than set trends. And I don't mean that in any derogative way. If a problem comes up, typically regulation is then set to solve the problem. I would set the challenge round to the regulator to turn around and look at it and go, we need to innovate to survive and to make and change the future. So how can they help, and what can they contribute in terms of enabling us to do some things?
And the value argument doesn't work. We provide more value to, you know, the country, the citizens, the customers, that they're not interested in that story.
If you turn around, if you turn around to the general public, I think they just want to see the lights on all the time, yeah. And if they go off, they want them on almost immediately afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah? And it's cheap, yeah? Yeah. So from an investor point of view, again, I would hope that they've got the insight to go say, some of these companies do need to innovate. And exactly like Heather said, we do a lot of things which fail. And instead of crucifying and hanging people at the gate, like was the old traditional ways, we encourage that. Not the hanging at the gate, of course, but, yeah. But the failing part. Yeah.
Here,
John, go ahead.
What I was going to say is just to jump in on that and maybe connect to the comment that you made. I think the real question is who innovates, right? Is it the LDCs effectively, right? The owners of the hard assets, or does that innovation take place outside of the industry? After which, look, if you can innovate, right, and come up with, let's just, a good example is obviously, as you said, grid modernization, et cetera, metering technologies, et cetera. Once that's sort of proven out, right, and you can kind of go to the regulator and say, look, there's an efficiency associated with that. We're going to put that into rate base, right, and then grow that way. Everyone loves that model, so long as, by the way, you can moderate rate increases, and that's the key. The real question, though, is where is sort of the marginal value for the industry, the electric industry, right? Is it letting effectively the Teslas of the world and other entities like that, Solar City, sort of innovate and then sort of figure out how that kind of fits into the industry, and therefore following, or or sort of making the argument to the customers, the ratepayers, and then ultimately the regulators that there's real value in allowing the people in this room, principally, right, to actually lead that innovation on behalf of the industry, on behalf of the customer, even if it means that the rate increase is above inflation, right? But that there's a value associated with owning that.
Stephen, go ahead.
Can I use a real life example? How many of you have got aging assets out there if you're an asset owner? Yeah?
All hands should be going up now.
Yeah, everyone. And we've got a lot of transmission overhead lines that were built in the 40s and 50s, which now are approaching sort of relatively end of life. And you can keep nursing them along for a while and put sticky plasters on here and there to stop them falling down. But I see a need, certainly in New Zealand, to invest in transmission to replace what we've got to meet the future need, especially like others mentioned before. If we're going to decarbonise transport and decarbonise industry, you could double or see a doubling of the consumption of electricity. You need a grid to support some of that. So if I'm faced with that problem in the future, the same as the rest of you around the table, what are we doing to innovate now to reduce what that big investment need is? Because if I look at the financing of that, we won't be able to raise enough capital to actually fund some of that with the gearing that we've got within the company that I work for. Have I got an appetite from the politicians and the public out there to go, oh, suddenly I've now been underinvesting for a while, now I need to build a lot of transmission assets, and your price is going to go through the roof? That's not an appetite either. And so I think there's a lot of not just market and other innovations that could happen, but there's a lot of technical innovations that could happen to try and solve some of those asset problems.
Yeah, I agree. And back to the role of the utility or energy company, we believe that is a key role. We believe that the utility or the energy company is the one that can integrate new technologies and new platforms in a way that you actually get the full value out of it. If we end up with stranded assets on one side and we have distributed resources which are not fully utilized, that is a societal cost that nobody can pay. So that is the crucial role of utility. It doesn't mean that the utility has to do everything. They still have to partner with the Teslas and the solar cities, but the utility has to make sure that the cost of the total system is in sync with the value that it provides to the customers. And that is the role of the utility. Jonathan, shareholder.
Yeah, our main shareholder is government. Yeah. And in Ghana, electricity has become a political commodity. And governments are voted into office or out of office, depending on how well the electricity sector is kept. So for us to have a very resilient and robust grid or network is very, very pertinent, and government would support us in renewing the system whenever they are called upon to do that.
Okay, so you got a lot of support there. Questions? Basil? Behind you, there's a microphone.
Thanks, John. I'm missing something. From an Aussie, I find it strange coming New Zealander. Why do we go back to being a traditional monopolist, where we say, oh, you need to fund me for innovation? I don't see Coca-Cola, when you buy the can of Coke for £1, that says 20p is for innovation or for R&D. Isn't it all about, rather than us, and this is a problem with the industry as I see it, that we expect the regulator to sort it out for us? And I mean, I take the UK regulation. We're incentivised to spend the least amount of money possible to deliver the relevant outputs. Because if I do that, then the shareholders, I'm adding shareholder value. And I'm adding value, a reduction in price to customers. So I don't need to be funded for innovation. I'm incentivised to innovate because that adds value to my shareholders. So all I've heard that we need to be funded, and I think that's the problem with the industry. What I think we should be talking about, how we're going to be incentivised by the regulator to innovate.
Yeah, so Basil's question is, are we the problem because we think the same way about innovation as we traditionally have been thinking about?
Sorry,
Stephen, go ahead.
I think you've absolutely nailed it on the head. If I turn around to our regulator, we're funded by putting up how many assets, how much they cost, when they're going to be replaced. And our whole funding model revolves around justifying almost a list of items that we do. And then internally, we then try and restack that. But it's a level of trust between us and the regulator then, in terms of they're expecting a very prescriptive list of things to be done, which we've defined. Yet over here, I much prefer to trust us, give us a bucket of money, let us do the right thing, to achieve the outcomes that we're hoping for, which will then allow a bit more flexibility in terms of how we innovate to achieve that solution. But I think you're absolutely right.
Andrew.
Thank you. Electric vehicles has come up on almost every discussion today, and that's not really a surprise. I'm keen to Heather dig a little bit more into some of what you said and see the other views on this. The head of Ireland's ESB last night told me a great line. He was looking at their emissions stack and he said, so the electricity sector is 30% of the problem and we can be 60% of the solution. And part of that is obviously electrifying transport in other areas. Heather, how's the rest of the province? Look, what's the public attitude to electric vehicles? What's the government and the policymakers? And obviously it's an ambitious plan from your end. How's the rest of society going there in Ontario on it? And also how are others seeing the EV space?
Well, I think it's still early days in Ontario. In terms of the public, an organisation within Ontario that was actually spun off of OPG called Plug and Drive has done a ton of research about the behaviours and the attitudes that people have around electric vehicles, what drives them to buy them, what drives them not to buy them. But I think what we're going to see with more and more of these vehicles coming on the roads, that people who used to have anxiety over the range, that's just not going to be the problem. There's vehicles that have, a 400-kilometer range. Certainly you can get there and back from work numerous times with that. The price points are coming down. Fortunately, as things stand right now with the government of the day, there's incentives that support the acquisition of an electric vehicle to the point where there's almost price parity. So those are very supportive things that are happening. At the same time, what's happening in Ontario is we're heading into a provincial election. And it's difficult to see what will transpire after that. It's difficult to see what party will win. It's difficult to see what will transpire after that. So that's going to drive a lot of it, I think. I think the incentives have made a big difference, but we're only at 15,000 or 16, 18,000 vehicles. I mean, there's so much room to grow there. But I think it's just a matter of when, not if, and it would be good to see supportive policies along the lines. And things like beneficial charging for electric vehicle owners. But, as I said, heading into a political election, it's challenging to know.
And Andrew, back to my Apple to Apple comparison, there's a bigger, at least Apple around transportation. It's not only the additional load, but it's actually the grid services around it, which is in most cases that we've seen half of the revenue model of the business model. So it's not only about the load, it's about the grid service as well with vehicle to grid integration and things like that. So that's an interesting value proposition. That's a new business for a utility, complete new. And you don't need to go to the regulator if there's a commercial valuable play for you there. You don't need to ask for money, you can just do it if you're allowed to do it. Andrew.
So Nigel Barber from Powerco. So as Stephen's third largest customer, I've already banked a 20% price reduction on the basis of those comments. So thank you. My shareholders and myself will be happy on that one. Look, a couple of comments or questions around carbon, and then one on sort of differences between markets. So Heather, interested, we're having the same debate around the last percentages of effectively decarbonising the electricity sector. Did I hear you correctly say you've sort of the consensus is not to worry about it or not? And then I'll run through the other questions, and the next one sort of, what do people see as the role of the price of getting a carbon price in there to stimulate doing things differently? I know, John, you talked about it in the context, slightly different context, but investors can see risk being attached with heavy polluting industries. So whether getting a carbon price in wholesale electricity markets would speed things along or not. And the last one is probably more for yourself, Jan, in your global role with Navigant, as to whether you're seeing a definite difference in sort of where you get structurally separated with markets, with regulated parts and unregulated, where you're seeing differences in the chain about who does the innovation and expectations on that. So 3 pieces there, and I'll leave you guys.
Yeah, you threw in the sustainability one. This is an innovation panel, but I will allow it. So Heather, you want to go first?
Okay, just on the carbon piece, I mean, I won't suppose to speak for the entire province of Ontario with that final wedge there, but I can speak at a high level about how OPG is considering viewing this. So lately we've turned our attention to, we've been saying for years we're at 99% greenhouse gas free, and the question becomes, are we driving towards carbon neutrality, or are we recognizing, that final 1% to drive that out is not the best way? Because if you start to think, well, how do you do that? I mean, do you buy offset credits? Do you undertake some other form of carbon mitigation? And it's early days, so don't quote me on this. Don't say that this is, OPG's official position, but it's becoming clear that it's probably not the most efficient or cost-effective way we can further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the discussion becomes around, well, let's just turn it around and make it more about transportation and facilitating broader greenhouse gas reductions in the province. So I wouldn't say no one cares about that final wedge, and not no one cares, but it's just there's more efficient ways and means to further reduce emissions. And now I'm forgetting what your second question was. Oh, carbon,
Right,
and
carbon
that's
price.
the idea. So rather than kind of chasing that final piece of the wedge, the idea is supposed to be that your cap and trade or whatever it might be, if it ends up being a carbon tax, right now it's cap and trade in the province, helps drive efficiencies within the organizations to further reduce and to tackle those more challenging areas that I spoke about within the industry. And that's how you're supposed to further drive that part down.
John, carbon price?
I'd say from an investor standpoint, in many respects, the market has sort of spoken irrespective of carbon tax. One of the big initiatives here at EEI over the last year or so has been ESG, and that's been precisely because many investors have effectively sort of are turning their backs increasingly on carbon intensity. And so that in and of itself, right, is if you want to attract capital, as an owner of assets, you're moving in that direction regardless because you need to attract, again, you need to sort of attract that capital. I think the second element that has, from a market perspective, has spoken is really just the cost competitiveness of wind and solar. And I think in many respects, you could argue with the cost curves continuing to come down, particularly on solar, wind as well, the need for a carbon tax, I think, is less clear today than it certainly was a decade ago. I think in many respects, you can argue that historical subsidies have sort of done their jobs, and at this stage, it's kind of up to the markets.
Yeah, so to your last question, I'll make a couple of controversial comments here. We have a huge challenge because we have market structures and regulatory frameworks that have been designed for a central station generation, transmission, distribution system. And nowhere in the world that is reality right now. And yes, some regions are further along than others, right? Germany, California, New York is trying hard, Ontario, than others. Like, I'm in the state of Florida, but it's coming. There is no question about that. Australia is far ahead. So they don't work. And we need to realize that, unbundled, decoupled markets might not be the right answer because they might not drive the best product or service to customers at the lowest cost possible. So I think we're going to see some re-regulation again because in this energy cloud world, there is a much tighter integration of processes and data to manage all these resources in a way that the total system costs are acceptable. So I don't think an unbundled, completely competitive market structure is the right answer for energy cloud everywhere in the world. It might be in some, but then you need to have very sophisticated systems and very sophisticated processes and alignment between all the different parties. It's becoming really, really complex. And to be honest, we're seeing that, for example, in the UK. How do you coordinate all that across all the different actors? It's going to be a challenge. So we're either going to have super technology that supports that with really solid processes and an AI that manages all that, or we're going to need to simplify maybe some of these market structures and actors again, which is an interesting question. What I do know is we have to step back because the current market structures and regulatory frameworks are not the right answer because we're living in a new world. That's my opinion on that. Last question. In the back.
Hi, it's Bill Kemp from Innovation Partners. Another question for Heather. Sort of the big elephant in the room, and use-wise, as far as electrification opportunities in most of the colder northern climates, is space heating. And I know there's been quite a bit of work going on in Canada around efficiency initiatives and technologies around that. Unfortunately, space heating is not manageable to the same degree that, say, car charging was, like you said, because the weather is what it is. Electric heat pumps don't work that well at very cold temperatures when there's no residual heat in the atmosphere. Can you talk about whatever's going on innovation-wise there?
I think my answer is going to be kind of lame. It's just, the focus is really when you look at that stack, you tackle the low-hanging fruit, and that's transportation, and there's no question the heat pumps, I mean, they're becoming more cost-effective, but it's a challenge, so I don't know the answer to that.
Thanks, Heather. We're going to round up this panel. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. It was definitely broader than technology, which I promised at the beginning. We spoke about a lot of different elements that are important as we all, as an industry and our individual companies, are trying to innovate. More to come here. I want to thank the panelists for joining, and I want to thank Lawrence for having us here.
Thank you, Jan, and thanks to Jan for this good moderation. Okay, so I know we're a little bit